know whether Jackson Wheat will be joining us for the show. I didn't get a call back yet on the tweet. If he materializes, he materializes. Welcome to Evolution Hour, where we are analyzing Replacing Darwin by Nathaniel Jeanson, source by bloody source by bloody source, and sundry other things, including a subject that I brought up last week because I was so hot and keen on it, and now I'm going into the great details on it, the Bouma affair, which you probably have not heard of because I didn't know about it, and most people didn't know it. It circulated as this Darwinist Gestapo case that has been circulating in little niches of the ID literature, but fortunately there'll be all the links on that. And anyway, let me thank right off the bat all of our patrons who are making it possible to do things like this show and the last one of the year 2021. Let's hope 2022 is better. Our colleagues Hendril, Colton, Eric Rowley, Suris, and Zeshi. Our researchers Travis Adams, Ian Chen, Convert Me, Stephen Early, Eat Meal, James Fitzwater, History Minor, Ralph McFadden, Paulogia, Ralph Pledger, Benjamin Simpson, Slava, Speed of Sound, Studio, DM Wing. Our command cyborg, assistant researchers Doronku, Jelly, the Lavender Lady, Hi Lavender Lady, Totus Real, Christopher Johnson. Our friends Antonin Bott, Steve Bauman, Marigale Beddoes, Daniel. Insects are cool, aren't they, though? Nyanya, Morton Nielsen, Paul the Skeptic, Puffalophagus, Bo Rasmussen, Devin Reeves, Alex Stone, and Paul Williams. And I will continue to thank the various legacy patrons who helped at one time or another. Jen, Jody, Mike, John, Keith, Andrew Dyer, Yui, Mona, Brad, Daniel, Stagel, Sun, Skystone, Ugly German Truths, Everett Vincent, and the Sur Weisbaum. Every one of you makes a difference because it's possible to keep going with the project. So for those who are knocking around, and I haven't seen anyone in the chat, let me put a little type in there, hi all, if anybody is in there, although I can perfectly well understand that many people will not be on because it's like the last week of the year and everyone's revving up for the New Year's and they'll maybe catch the video later and so forth and so on. So it's not a hyper concern. I'm here in Seattle still, where we're still with snow and preternaturally cold weather. They typically don't get down into the 20s like they are here. It's even colder over in Spokane. I'll find out what life is like after I get back and figure out whether or not I can get into my driveway or not. Anyway, Nathaniel Jeanson. One of the primary lessons that I've been trying to instill in everybody in the oh, hello, Lavender Lady. Hello, how are you on this last couple of days of 2021? Nathaniel Jeanson, going through the sources of this, just as I did with the Rupin Sanford book earlier, is something that I really encourage anybody who is critical of creationism, who has access to sources that are particularly ones that don't have reference bibliographies or detailed sourcings, to go through and beef it up. Find out what the data field is and make it available to people, post online, do all those sorts of things. And eventually, I think I'll probably want to have some material where we'll have a website where we can make an archive of these things so that everyone who needs to have a full-blown reference bibliography that Nathaniel Jeanson didn't put in his book will be able to do so. Erica Gutsick Gibbon is going through Rupin Sanford's book, and it helps an enormous amount if you already have a sense of where the references are and where you can find out about it. But anyway, that's I think an important tool that anybody that wants to be in this field, who has access to library information or works that may be older that get used in the field, or the brand new, if you plug for money to buy the latest creationist twaddle to criticize, make the most of it and do a work on it. Anyway, I had mentioned last week that Jeanson had stuff on diapause, which is the dormancy tendency in a lot of different organisms, particularly in invertebrates and that, to go into dormancy phases, and it pops up in various ways. And although he dribbled a couple papers on it, he was only bringing it up as a way to somehow cast doubt on the reliability of using mitochondrial DNA mutation rates over long terms, because theoretically the organism could go dormant, and so actually a different time might be involved. Although this would, you'd think, if you have a measurable mutation rate and the organism goes into dormancy a lot, that maybe it's a lot older than it appears to be just on the basis of the mutation rate rather than younger. But that would seem to be a minor detail. This next one, buried in his footnotes, was a more recent paper, 2017, by Zanato, and I'll be putting the link up to that. The title is Diapause and Ancient Adaptation in Drosophila. Oh, that sounds like an interesting topic, and it is an interesting topic, and which makes me wonder why Jeanson went to all this trouble to dribble it in, since it really isn't helping his position any. It's only reminding us of data that he's not accounting for, because it had as its one of its conclusions along the way, quote, "Our results suggest that Diapause may be an ancient character that emerged in the tropics to resist unfavorable seasonal conditions and which has been enhanced during D. melanogaster's colonization of temperate regions," unquote. Which means we're talking about when fruit flies developed, how they got to be in the locations that they are, and how their biogeographical spread from the tropics north was occurring, and how that was fitting in with the biology of that. Jeanson would need to accommodate that within his young Earth framework. He would have to take all of that biogeographical data at some point and deal with it. He's clearly not doing it in this book. Why is he bringing up the paper at all? It's, I think, just part of the idea that if he just dribbles technical literature out there under the impression that it is supporting or helping his argument in some way, maybe he's literally not thinking that anybody's going to ever bother to look. And in most anti-evolution cases, they don't look. They just think, oh, he's put documentation in. By the way, the source list so far, it looks like he's about in the range of about 500 sources, which for a book of this size is translating to about 1.7 or 8 sources per page. It's very, very slim. A fairly good chunk of it, over a quarter, turned out to be young Earth creationist material. And then a modest amount of technical literature, of which he's running about 50% misrepresented. Not doing good. Rupp and Sanford are in about that same ballpark. The one difference between Jeanson and Rupp and Sanford's book is that Sanford isn't authority quoting much. In fact, he's not really quoting much at all. He's basically repeating his arguments and a lot of his charts and things that he's put in his technical papers that he's put in creationist websites. So as a treatise that was really attempting to clearly say what its position is and be very aware of the potential problems in the position and fairly representing an explanatory model that can account for data as effectively as possible, oh, it's just miserably bad. And it's understandable why this book is unlikely to gain any more traction than John Sanford's Genetic Entropy or anything else. So I will beg off on the excuse that because of the holiday things, I only put one little Jeanson source up on this. But we're making up for it with the other half of the show, which relates to our little fellow Bouma, an elderly lawyer who got in the anti-evolution biz and became a cause celeb. And I'll try to get a kind of a background because it took a while to kind of ferret out where all the information was coming from on this one. So in the 1960s, this guy, who's apparently a couple years older than I am, was getting the anti-evolution bug. He lived in Texas, which had been knee-deep when he was going to college and others. This was all in the period when the Gablers were rampaging on getting secular humanism out of the textbooks and attacking evolution and all that. None of which, by the way, he seems to be aware of. If he is, he isn't telling anybody about it. And in 1998, by that time, he had clearly caught the intelligent design bug, and he founded the rather pretentiously labeled National Association for Objectivity in Science. And I'll be putting the link to that website on there. For those of you who are just terribly anxious to see lots of objective science at this website, forget it. No, Lavender Ladies as well, Jane. We've got more than just one person. We've got a whopping 2. Hello there. So that's something. But a lot of, again, it doesn't bother me the fact that a lot of people are busy with the holidays and all of that. So if they aren't able to watch right away, hopefully they'll be able to check up on it later. Anyway, a lot of this information I was able to find out about Bouma because of a lecture that he was giving at his church. where he was explaining the background of all of this flap a little bit. So he was giving a little bit about his background and his educational material to get a little bit of better sense of the chronology of how he was coming up to this. But anyway, if one goes to, hello, Vesta, I've got 3. If one goes to his National Association for Objectivity in Science website, it's not much. There's only a few little tabs and pages across, and it consists basically of some undocumented, unreferenced authority quotes, which are casting doubt on Darwin and the origin of life and macroevolution. It's like taking the Discovery Institute and running its contents through a sieve and then distilling it down in a little bowl that you keep out in the sun until there's just a little crusty leftover. That's what you're getting on this little website. Now, one of the page links happened to be about sources. And it turns out he has a whopping 5. His references that he alludes to, they're all anti-evolution books, almost all from the intelligent design perspective. He's got Denton's 1985 Evolution, a Theory in Crisis, not the 2016 book, not the more recent one. So apparently he hasn't updated it any in the many years since. And then Philip Johnson's 1991 Darwin on Trial. And then Darwin's Black Box from Behe in the 1990s. The very bad of Pandas and People, which of course was the one that was the cause celeb in the Dover trial. And then the one that made my little heart go pit-a-pat. The abysmally bad 1997 Shattering the Myths of Darwinism by Richard Milton, my poster child for scholarly incompetence. Milton, who is about my age and a British, air quotes, science writer, is much more prolific than some in the area, but he's almost invisible on the field because he's a weird example of an anti-evolutionist who is functionally a young earth creationist without being religious. So he has problems with the millions of years age of the earth, and he cites a bunch of young earth creationist material. If you go to my website, the tortucan.com, when I go plowing through particularly the Deinomania chapter, there's a lot on Richard Milton. And he was just appallingly bad. And so I can only think that this pileup of sources, that Bouma at no point ever did anything for fact checking to see whether or not any of these people were saying things that were accurate. So where do we get to this flap that pops along in 2019? He decides that he's going to be doing a presentation at a teachers' conference. He's not actually an educator himself, although he has his National Association for Objectivity in Science, which apparently consists of him. And he got this in on how Darwin reacted to his critics was the technical title of the piece. I think Darwinian, let's see, you'll find out. Darwin's response to his objectors and its relevance for today. That was the title that he had. And it sounded perfectly innocuous. And in a sense, most of the content was perfectly innocuous. It was hard to kind of ferret it out, but fortunately, Bouma ended up posting on his little website a link to a PDF of what I can only assume is a version of the paper because it's dated 2021. And that's after the 2019 presentation time would have been. So he clearly has made modifications to it. Of what form, I don't know. I doubt he made much modifications onto it. Anyway, somewhere just right before the show was to go on at that convention in 2019, the organizers, complete with armed guards, at least in his version, come up and pull the plug on his presentation at the very last minute, confiscating his website, his PowerPoint slides, and the whole 9 yards. And he was terribly distressed about this. And pretty soon, a bunch of people at the Discovery Institute were very distressed about it. Casey Luskin went off about this example of Darwinian Gestapo activities and how terrible and awful they were. David Klinghoffer put some posts up on it, and Bouma himself did a post on it at the hyper-conservative CNS News in 2020, and then the Discovery Institute, he did one there in 2021, and I'll be putting all the links up to all of that stuff. Yes, it's I agree completely on the effing cold part over here. I'm used to it. I'm not a problem on it, but it's about 30 degrees colder, 20 or 30 degrees colder in Seattle than it typically is. And they've got snow and low temperatures and all that. And it's a little nippy still, even in Spokane. I was checking up on the weather report there. It's only like 15 over in there, and we're supposed to get a little bit more snow. So it all depends on what the passes are like to whether I can get home comfortably after New Year's or not, and then find out whether I can get into my driveway, because you get snow berms where the driveway is and all of that. And so I may have to be a while to excavate a way into. It depends on how much snow. And I made sure the driveway and everything was all cleaned out before I left. So anything that's on there has been timed things. There's the weather report for Spokane, Washington, and Jimmy's driveway. Isn't that exciting? Anyway, back to Bouma. Jerry Bergman even weighed in on this thing in 2021. And for once, it's fun to compare the Bergman versions to the Casey Luskin and David Klinghoffer and Bouma versions, in that almost nothing in the intelligent design discussions of these things told anything about what he said, his content. They just dealt with generically. It's interesting that Bergman was the only one who actually mentioned a little bit of the content, which was an example of a bunch of supposed claims that Darwin was discussing back in the days that are still a problem for Darwinism today. The eyes, whales, the alleged lack of transition in the fossil record and stuff that is all remarkably routine for anti-evolution material. And incidentally, Bergman offers, and you can see when you see the link on it, smoldering -3 there at the morning with Jin. Okay, yes. Everybody take really good care in the cold weather. Check to see if your windshield wipers are frozen to the windshield. You might want to check up on that. They can easily get iced up. It's particularly of concern if you get freeze-thaw cycles going on. You can have slippery ice underneath snow and all of that. So everybody takes special care on that. Anyway, so you can compare Bergman's fairly superficial account to the really superficial account of the stuff at the Discovery Institute and the other posting venue that Bouma dealt with. Well, by this time, I was getting curious. I wanted to see his presentation. And it turns out, bless him, he posted a PDF of the whole thing so you could actually see probably what he was presenting, bearing in mind it was actually dating after the presentation itself. And then he discussed and read chunks of it on this video that he did at the Adult Fellowship broadcast of the National Presbyterian Church, where he is a member. And I'll be putting the link up onto that. It intrigues me how long it took. This was like an hour-long video, of which about 45 minutes of it was him reading. And he just barely dented this presentation. So either he was planning on reading this whole bloody thing and it would have gone on for 2.5 or 3 hours easy at the rate that he reads, or the presentation that we see in the final video or in the PDF is not necessarily all the stuff that he was planning on presenting at the conference. It's hard to tell one way or another, but he does show quite a few of the slides that he had up, and he skips through several of them, so we can presume that we're getting a fairly accurate representation of the content that was going to be at the show. Now, it is true that he didn't go out of his way to discuss God or any of these things. But all you needed to do was to see the website. You could see that he was an intelligent design style anti-evolutionist. And if you want to get picky, an inaccurate redactor of his material, several of which I just jumped out at me when I was seeing it, and are stuff, fortunately, that's in both the PDF text and also the video part. One of them has to do with the fact, and I mentioned this to Jackson last week, and he got eyebrow raises on that one, that, quote, by 1869, Wallace had abandoned his theory of natural selection and subscribed to a theory of design, unquote. No. Now, how did he come to think that? In fact, if there's one thing that's really clear about Wallace all the way down to the end of his life, is he was a hyper defender of natural selection as the only mechanism that operates in evolution. And he was having a big knockdown drag out with Darwin. Well, Darwin was alive over sexual selection, which he didn't agree with. And he also objected to the analogy that Darwin did from artificial selection to natural selection. So if anything, Wallace was more of a hyper natural selection selectionist than Darwin was. How then did he think of this theory of design? Well, it's because there have been a bunch of people, including David Klinghoffer, who have been presenting the trope that Wallace was not a normal evolutionist after all, and he had abandoned this. And in some ways, he did move away from the kind of naturalistic approach that Darwin had for just the whole shebang. And it involves some familiar things. One, the origin of life. Another one, the origin of consciousness and mind, all of that stuff. And I think maybe some of the phyletic structure, the Cambrian explosion issue, the origin of basal forms was a thing that was a concern to him. But in part, what this had to do with his idea about mind as a designer of things, it wasn't the mind of the God of Abraham, it was the spiritualist mind. And so it was not really a philosophical position that connected up with it, but it was a religious one. But as for everything else, even in his late writings, and you can find them online, you can download his works and read them yourself, at no point was he denying what we would call the big picture vision, that the vast majority of life comes about from natural common descent. Bingo. And at no point did Wallace give that up, certainly not in 1869 and not in 1913 when he was dead. We've still got yucky stuff of sewers freezing up from Vesta is noting. Yes, that's another thing to make sure because I'm used to the cold climate, Spokane gets cold in the winter, and that I always put faucet protectors and stuff on the outside faucets that act as insulators. You can buy them, they look like little Quonset hut things that you can attach onto the back end of the stuff. Keeping the house warm enough that you don't have frozen pipes, because the last thing you want to do is have that kind of a breakup. Anyway, welcome to the wonderful 21st century when we have extremely wacky weather things going on. Good old Bouma kept going, though. And here is one where is the advantage of seeing his presentation. And I can't help but wonder whether this slide, which is not alluded to in the text version, but is in the video version, and it has to do, comes 43 minutes in. Bouma quoted Darwin's worrying about the gaps in the horse origin series, which back in 1880s was something that was unclear. The vast majority of fossils in this area were only discovered later. Huxley was involved with a lot of that. But amazingly, Bouma puts a slide up that actually shows, and he probably got it off of Wikipedia or somewhere. It's a fairly straightforward slide, but it showed modern equus, the late Miocene Pliohippus, the middle Miocene Merychippus, and the late Eocene Mesohippus. In other words, a bunch of the examples that were filling in the very gap that Darwin was worrying about before the fossils were discovered. So I have to wonder, did Bouma not know what he was looking at when he was finding these things? That were all the names just buzzwords and background things, that he didn't realize the context of that he was now putting up evidence that directly related to whether or not this was a problem anymore. And Bouma at no point seems to think that any of the last 100 years of paleontology has made any difference, because he ends his piece with a firm affirmation that these criticisms of Darwin are just as valid today as they were in the 1880s. And no, that's not really the case. And plus that he never offers any references for any of these kind of side issues. And so I'm inclined to think that Bouma really does have a filtered version that was obtained entirely by reading superficial versions in the various books that he listed and glossed over that, and that became his model for it, because the horses come up peripherally in Philip Jeanson. I think they're mentioned a little bit along the way in Denton. They still get used as tropes in anti-evolution things, and I think there were references to the horse bit in Richard Milton. It doesn't pop up in Michael Behe because he doesn't deal with most of the fossil record in that. Anyway, So there was no Q&A in the video, just the end piece where after an invocation, I think they come up and do a little brief prayer because it isn't a church after all. Oh, BJ, hi all. We got on our cold December night here, the last show of 2021. Apparently everybody is freezing in all the different venues where anybody is watching the show, including here in Seattle, where they're 10, 20, 30 degrees colder than it's what it's supposed to be. We're lucky to get up, although it's supposed to be by the weekend that I'm planning on skedaddling out of here. It looks like we may be up in the 40s in Seattle, but what's going on over the passes and then over to Spokane, that's another matter. So I'm not sure what. Doesn't look like it's going to get very warm over in that area. Anyway, back to good old Bouma. The similarly elderly host, Jim Anderson, at this lecture that Bouma was giving at his church, got up and blathered on how much, quote, information, unquote, had been presented by Bouma. And in fact, all it was a set of quotations from Darwin relating to a variety of very arcane issues, that all of which can be disposed of by following up on the source citations of stuff since. But Bouma didn't present that. But in the end, it was the way he concluded that was absolutely hilarious, because about 52 minutes in, he says it was so glad that they had so much information from Bouma, quote, about a man whom I think that many of us know very little about. We've heard about Charles Darwin and his theories of relativity and the origin of the species. Relativity? Sorry, that's that Einstein guy. Different person. Although admittedly, common descent, things are related to one another, but no, it's not the theory of relativity. So you wonder just how many people, there was no indication as to how many people were in the audience. There were not a huge amount of, I couldn't recall hearing much in the way of applause. So it's hard to say whether or not they had a large house listening to this in 2020 or very few. Difficult. No sources indicated, no linkages to material and all the rest. But anyway, so I found this a wonderfully fascinating example of not only an elderly person venturing outside of their area, thinking that they're going to dive into the Darwinian evolution controversy, presumably from his scholarly point of view. And it's clear that I think a lot of the examples that he's culling are taken directly from the book. And his point was, in part, an apologetic one, which is that Darwin was very polite with his critics, and he dealt with various critics without any rancor in that respect. He was very firm, however, and that therefore we should be doing the same thing today, as if the criticisms that are being leveled against modern evolution are as legitimately founded as the criticisms that were being leveled against Darwin when the theory was initially being produced. And I'm afraid that ain't going to cut it, because anybody criticizing Darwin in the 1860s and 70s and 80s, Darwin, Wallace, and others paid very close attention to them over the years. And they were in areas where they didn't know a lot. They didn't have a lot of the fossils. They knew nothing about the genetics. They knew very little about a lot of the developmental biology. That was all for the future to work out. And then, of course, the development of genetics takes place in the 20th century. The discovery of DNA and how the mechanisms of inheritance work is only coming after the 1950s. Homeobox genes and higher level developmental genes and the various networks of regulatory systems are only developing since the 1990s. Really, the only book in that bunch that's trying to tackle that aspect of it would be Michael Behe, and Behe deck stacks and misrepresents and funnels up information. So the reason why, yes, we should be completely polite with critics of modern evolutionary theory, but we, yes, now BJ had a degree in Darwinian physics. Yes, it only took 1 second. That's because you go to maybe you go to PragerU. I think they could probably chew them out at that speed. They're definitely in the Darwinian thing. I think an awful lot of young Earth creationists imagine physics is Darwinian because they lump it all together. um, quantum theory and the Big Bang theory and all of that in one big mush of evolutionary points of view, because, of course, young Earth creationism conflicts so radically with any of the data field. But the thing that Bouma doesn't seem to appreciate is that it's not a balanced thing to treat a modern person who should know better, that their criticisms are on the same level as people slogging around in a period before the data was discovered. So there were, even when you're dealing, he mentions, by the way, Bouma picks up several of the big critics, Louis Agassiz, and then there's also another fellow, Petty, and Carl Negele. There were quite a few of them that were mentioned along the way in Darwin's time, but I had to actually do some research on them because they're so absolutely inconsequential. Negele turned out to be kind of a funny figure because he not only was a critic of Darwin and was towards the tail end of his career, but he had interactions with Mendel. And probably because I don't think Bouma does much research in this little area, that Negele was actually trying to discourage Mendel from continuing work on genetics because he thought it was outside of his area of expertise and it was a waste of time on this kind of stuff. This other fellow, Francois Jules Pictet, Pictet, who died in 1872, and he was kind of a progressive creationist. I couldn't find a heck of a lot about him. He's so inconsequential that he just falls off the scope. So all that Bouma was doing was kind of diving into the discussions that were coming from fairly prominent scientists of the period, but their work didn't lead to anything, and that's why they're so relatively forgotten now. Part of the thing about Louis Agassiz that only keeps him in the public eye is that he was one of those who was one of the first to push ice ages, not came up with the idea. He actually borrowed it from other people and took credit for it, which is an interesting personality trait, and of course was a flaming racist and anti-evolutionist, but he was a knowledgeable person on fish, fossils, and others, at least the amount of fossil data that was available in the 1860s and 1870s. And there's a nice biography of Agassiz. I think we allude to it in The Rocks Were There. That's, we'll definitely be alluding to it in volume 2 of The Rocks Were There. Yes. Almost anyone would have a degree that is more valid than Dr. Dino's. Erica, I just watched today, Erica did a video analysis of Eric Hovind, who has been cleaving away from Daddy Kent, although he stole a slew of the website material that Kent had. And I've been seeing bits and pieces about that. Hovind did a rebuttal video today with extremely bad audio, and PC Myers and Going to Go For It are going to cut it up on Thursday. Yes, I was hearing the bits about that. I hadn't realized that they were talking about Kent Hovind. There were several people that were talking about how absolutely ghastly it was. I think Atheist Junior has been looking at all that too. I haven't had a chance to see that. I am predicting that it will be absolute claptrap, but it will be complete self-confidence, because Hovind has never had any shortage of self-confidence. Anyway, this thing that Erica had done, Eric Hovind had done this video about a night at the Creation Museum, which was kind of a half-assed, but not horribly inept, attempt to kind of riff off of the style of A Night at the Museum, even though it's a very old movie, and play up the creationism aspect. And why they're so much better than that nasty evolutionist stuff. And they had a little short appearances with Tim Chaffee and I can't think of the other guy that was talking about the physics and astronomy part. Name suddenly escapes me. Anyway, both of those two are going to be popping up in the second volume. Chaffee has a lot of wacky stuff to do. And of course, Hovind's never going to check any of that stuff out. But Erica had a particular bone to pick because they were making a big deal about the chimpanzee-like interpretation of the Australopithecine Lucy, which is just claptrap wrong. It's absolutely indefensible scientifically. And indeed, there's even a young Earth creationist that Jackson had called my attention to last week, Peter Crummell, new kid on the block. We'll have to see what he's been doing. So I was spending time looking up that material. At his Paleo Logos site, and most of the videos that he's been doing since he got online in September are on human evolution stuff. But he's looks like he might be falling in that kind of Todd Wood category of a fair creationist who acknowledges when there are problems that are unresolved, even if they can't come up with a good answer on it, because he's criticizing the arguments about how the Creation Museum and that depict Lucy the Australopithecine. They're getting this stuff wrong. And he's criticizing the is Genesis history or Genesis apologetics, that angle. So we'll see whether or not we've got some really fun and games going on it. Yes, Erica tore into it today. And since that's her direct field, Erica knows the insides out and has posted in great detail on this and is currently plowing through Rupin Sanford's book on the human evolution argument. It's right up her wheelhouse. So others of us have come to similar conclusions on this stuff from different directions, but she's got an awful lot about the physical details of things. It's a fascinating phenomenon to do. And by keeping track of all of this stuff, everybody in this area can do better and better at criticism. I urge everybody that criticizes creationists to always do their homework. Don't necessarily try to be a polymath unless you got the time. If you have a normal life, you'll need to do your normal life. So what you'll need to do is to focus in on particular topics that really fascinate you, to where you can dive in and study them at source level, so that you can know what the facts are physically and what the creationists are claiming and what sources the creationists are or are not using. And then you can point out how, if they are using certain sources, are they valid? Are they misrepresented? Are they dated or whatever? And then also information that they're not presenting, and whether or not they should have known about this or not. That can only come, regardless of what the topic is, if you study it at depth. And fortunately, so much of the material is coming to be available. People post them at Academia EDU and ResearchGate, or the journals are open access if it's older content. And so there's an awful lot available. Some of the stuff that you might find in books, especially on the creationist side, books that are printed by creationists will not necessarily be accessible other than if buy the bloody book. And I don't encourage people to just funnel money into the hands of creationists that way. But you may be able to find out relevant information and segments about who has discussed the work secondarily. And also you can contact various people in the network to say, oh, have you heard about this? And build up an argument that way. So, oh, do we have a troll wandering around in here? What do we got going on here? Not a troll, a bot. Who's our little, do we have one in this bit or what? Hi, Brian, another person in there. It's measured temp of lambda of emitted so that all heat is measured, not just as felt. In that way, flurfers will say it's fake. Yeah, heat, it's funky how heat, which is a sidebar of thermodynamics, the way energy passes from one medium to another, is a bane for just about everybody that believes claptrap. Whether or not you're a flat earther trying to deal with the thermodynamics of how you could have the sun be so small and generate the energy that it does, or does it do the energy it does, et cetera, et cetera. And then, of course, the catastrophic plate tectonics and all the attempts to scrunch all of the geological formations and asteroid impacts and that into a tiny time frame. It's a mess. Yeah, absolute mess. Once I get back to Spokane, then I can resume my full dive on continuing on the rocks were there. Jackson is working on his material in addition to getting his degree, so he's got a life as well. And we're looking forward to a really fun volume 2 to go along with volume 1. We're both keeping track of topics that we didn't discuss at great length in the first book. Although we covered a lot, as anybody that has the rocks were there will show, The second book has a lot more to cover in it because we had to split the chapter titles up in that. So there's a bunch of material that further geological background and information, paleo worlds. There's all the human evolution stuff. There's more on the fossils and the origin of vertebrates and that we had to leave to subsequent chapters. And we'll also have a whole chapter that will be picking up the speed on work that we did in the first book that's follow-up and newer material on that. The area that I'm currently working on is the Big Slosh chapter, which is all about the flood myths and how that filters into things, and the people trying to find Noah's Ark, and the people who think that they can find living dinosaurs living down in Africa, and or pictures of people painting pictures of them during the Middle Ages and calling them dragons. And it's just a unintentionally hilarious pileup of wishful thinking and misrepresentation and data suppression and secondary source riffing. That it's just when you think that it can't get stupider, somebody else comes along and gets stupider. So it's I think it'll be rather funny. There's also some really serious sides to it because of the issues that we're tiptoeing initially into the whole issue about the biblical versus Darwinian racism and where that prejudice and things come from, and how biblical views aren't off the hook on this. And then we're going to be going into much greater detail on it in one of the later chapters, where we are discussing that whole Darwinian racism and eugenics and the Nazis and the Soviet Union and things that are still very active tropes. It pops up. Tangelo in his debate with Ian Chen just a couple of weeks ago was pulling out the stops on all of those same tropes, and it's way more complicated than that, and hardly as easily and helpful. I've distilled it down to the basic notion is that if you are a person who is by nature a racist, you're going to find ways of dressing it up. And when the biblical paradigm is the accepted model, you're going to find evidence for it in that. Or if you come from another religion, you'll dress it up in that guise. If you are coming from a society that is science-based and secular, and you still want to be a racist, you dress it up in sciencey garb, and you use all the current theories, whatever you want. Give me a preface. We got a bit about source account and a trace back on thing. What was the bot doing something in our field here? I didn't see any unfamiliar names knocking around in here. K-sub Basam 90, that one with the clever message voom.ong. Is that who we're talking about? It would be nice if people, when they put up gibberish, that at least they sound like something other than gibberish. But I'm afraid that does sound suspiciously like just a bot that's popping in. You get that in some of the postings that we do in some websites. You get commenters on them that are just asking that you go to a website to look for Viagra. So you have a whole slew of just spam issues in that. Yeah, it happens. What can one do? At least, there's probably not an actual organism there. It's all some server humming away somewhere in who knows where that's doing all of this completely autonomously. There's nobody to actually deal with, which means that it's annoying, but it's not frustrating and appalling in the way that an actual living organism is. And we've gotten not nobody in this particular episode, but in previous times, that just troll in there and they want to put their little religious motivations or their creationist truths that they think that everybody needs to know about. And they don't know what they're talking about, but they're very certain that they're right. And when they pop up in the comments in the main video, if they're just dropping their stuff for apologetic purposes, I say, no, stop that. Don't do that again. Otherwise, I'm going to be knocking you out, because I don't like to ban people or delete comments. And as a general rule, I don't. And the only times that I've done that are with people who just have their agenda and they're going to run with it. The little fellow, God, I've forgotten his little name, that haunted the shows in the early seasons and that, and he just kept going back and forth, and you try to get a discussion on some technical issue, and he would just go off repeating his stuff. He was channeling an awful lot of Rupi and Sanford and basically believing everything that they had to say. And I finally said, oh, but if you can't answer this particular issue on this point here, please document this claim that they were making about, I think, radiometric dating and the diamond issue. And he could never deal with that particular thing. And I said, well, until you do, none of your comments will be accepted. So he would try to post stuff after that without discussing that particular thing that he was making the claim about and defending it and contacting the scientists to find out whether or not what he was saying about them was even remotely correct. He would not do that. So boop, I go, no, we're not going to have any more on that. So it's an undefined root source. No person can shift that fast. Yeah, this another reason for keeping more of the electronic world separate and not trying to have amalgamations under everybody using the same formats and everybody using the same institutional systems is precisely because of that. If something can be hacked into it, it can do its little business so quickly that it's very, very difficult to deal with. So independence and separate systems that can't be compromised from one another make sense. Yes. Now, yes, here on a brighter note, yes, the 2021 was another great year for finding dinosaurs. Things move so fast now, not just dinosaurs. I mean, we finally got the Webb telescope put up. And so next year, we're going to be seeing what wonders are in that and a level of observation that will presumably blow away the old Hubble telescope. And it's going to be yet more information for the young Earth creationists at Answers in Genesis to ignore. They will not ignore it completely. They'll tiptoe around the edges. They'll go harumph on things, but it's a constantly moving target. And so in some respects, for about every quarter of a microsecond, I feel kind of sorry for doctrinal creationists because they're just so far behind the curve, and the curve is just getting farther and farther ahead of them. And so the best they can do is to kind of just tiptoe along, snarking about the incoming material. David Capege does that, and you get a little bit of that from some other ones. The various posters you see, particularly in the comment sections at CMI and that setup. But they can't go very far with it. They're never going to be able to have an explanatory model that can explain even the old data, let alone all the new ones. And meanwhile, all of us science groupies, we're just in seventh heaven on this because it's absolutely delightful. Any of you out there that are as old fart as I am will know that in our lifetime, we have gone from knowing no planets in existence around other solar systems, only hypothetical, to an abundance of them that we can tell oodles about them. And as these new telescopes and things come into play, can see even more about it. So I'm anticipating that the next 10 or 20 years, which will certainly be within my lifetime, unless I get hit with an asteroid, will be even more delightfully exciting. And when I think about the fact that I'm sort of glad that I didn't take biology in high school, because I would have had to have unlearned so much of the light tropes that were around in that pre-DNA area, because, books that were in the 1960s, they were just beginning to take notice of DNA as a system. But so much of our present understanding of the interconnectedness and dynamic nature of it doesn't come until the homeobox era in the 1990s on. And now that we have an even better system, geology is yet another area that is just poised on spectacular developments, because they're starting to do really sophisticated deep imaging of the Earth that can make sense with paleo events relating to plate tectonics. I've alluded to this several times, and you encounter this in the stuff that's going on. If you haven't followed Nick Zentner's lecture videos from Central Washington University down there, because he keeps track of an awful lot of this incoming material and talks to people and deals with the current cutting edge issues of things. And basically what it means is there's been an awful lot of plate movements and magmatic provinces and stuff that have done their shtick and been very active, and then only fragments of which get preserved in the parts that you can walk around on the surface. So in my own Pacific Northwest, we've got little bits and pieces of very ancient rocks that are just sprinkled and crammed and jammed up into things that you have to pull it apart like a gigantic jigsaw puzzle to realize that there was a massive stuff going on, and the plate movements involve much more than what we were thinking of even like 15 or 20 years ago. And they can do more imaging of the crumpling process that takes place as these plates get subducted. Just in the same way that archaeology is undergoing a revolution in the ability to do LiDAR imagery, to where you can see huge amounts of settlements in the Maya world that they didn't know about in previous time. Oh, yes, Lavender Lady, yes, that's the one thing to take from the very disagreeable aspect of the dialysis chair. You get sucked into the world of Zentner's geology, and the fellow is just so exciting and entertaining and funny, and he doesn't take himself seriously, and he's aware of areas that he's very cautious on things where he'll often say, well, this isn't my area of expertise, so I'm only just tiptoeing into it. When in fact, he's very knowledgeable on these things, but he's also very, very cautious, careful lecturer. And I think it's no coincidence that he had a theatrical background before he got into the geology thing. And so that is an area that I think an awful lot of teachers should probably be mindful of, is if they are comfortable with it, take a theater course, act in a play, do improv, and areas where you have to learn the theatrical comfort of being up in front of an audience, and also the presentational aspect of how you can use props and things in ways that are humorous and entertaining and attention grabbing. And it's more than merely the massive factoids. That even if you're terribly knowledgeable, the ability to present it, and I don't for a moment claim that I have that kind of skill level in myself. I've been in the theater and all that, and it helps me a lot in my writing, but I don't have quite the schmoozy comfort level that some might need. But it's something to consider as the interdisciplinary approach. Oh yes, and the fact that we are at good old Isaac Newton's birthday, we just passed that, and it's something of real importance that's taking place actually on December 25th, because of course we know that if there actually was a there we go, any historic Jesus was unlikely to have been born in December. It's about April or somewhere around in there, but it only got rammed over into there because they wanted to consolidate it with the Saturnalia and the Sol Invictus celebrations and all of that. So people move things around on that, and holidays then mutate over time and all that. It's inevitable. 1,000 years from now, if human beings are still knocking around, and if we've moved out into other planets, they'll mutate them as well. How much will the standard Christmas tree mentality change if you're not living in climates that are cold? That'll be a factor. If you go to an alien planet where the seasons are entirely differently structured and all of that, and if most of your settlements are in places that are in the tropics, will that Christmas tree and Santa's elves and chestnuts roasting on the open fire become so completely alien as an antiquated historical thing that no one will know diddly squat about it? I won't be around to see that, but distant future generations will. But don't be surprised if things mutate and change over time, because they always do. Can't stop it. The main thing is, if we can avoid causing the extinction of the planet or extinction of organisms along the way, then we can live with mutant traditions about Christmas trees and Santa's elves. So we managed to get through. I'm absolutely gobsmacked at how good the signal was all this time. It was all nice up in the upper echelon thing. Yay, apparently nobody's on the internet. That's probably what it accounts to. Everyone's home, as they should be, with their family and friends, gearing up to get hammered on New Year's Eve. Any questions or comments from those in the live chat here while we're concluding the end of the show? We'll hopefully be able to do a thing in another week, by which time I'll be back in Spokane, and we'll plug in the remainder of the stuff to go on. There's still several chapters to go with Jeanson's book, and I'm not at all sure many news sources he's actually going to be offering in, because there's big long swaths of where he's basically putting up data fields that he's culled from the various technical papers, in which it's a functionally meaningless information because there's no way you can make any sense out of it. Oh, how a local news piece is. Yes, the piece, Mr. Football, a piece, and no mention of Desmond Tutu. Yeah, I saw references to it on Twitter and that, and so it all depends. I'm sure the BBC or some of these others would have some comments on it. I haven't been following a heck of a lot about the news on things. E.O. Wilson died as well. That we'll get glowing obituaries from some quarters, and others will be infuriated and happy that he's gone. He was a controversial fellow over a long, long period of time, and interesting. And his conservation material, on the one hand, and if you look back, there's some that still have fumes about him because of the sociobiology issue, which is now what would be called evolutionary psychology. So anyway, times pass, things change. We continue to move on it. So we're at 55 minutes, and I will say if there's no questions on here, I'll probably end up closing off the show for the year. Everybody stay safe. If you haven't gotten your booster yet, do it. If you have access to like COVID testing units, now that they're becoming more accessible, although there's a lot of shortages on them. If you live in areas where there are an awful lot of unvaccinated people, kind of steer clear of them. I'll be going back over to Spokane, where we're next door to Idaho, which is much more Looney Tunes state. And so there's people flipping back and forth on that area as well. But I've been seeing pretty much people wearing masks and things around on this side of the state. So everybody stay very careful on here, weather the storm, and get into the next season. I'm just finishing up. I finished up chapter 33 of the second Phileas Fogg book, and so I got 4 chapters to go to complete that little pile up and get that out of the way. So with a little luck, then early in 2022, I'll be able to get that out of the way, and we'll be targeting for mid to late 2022 for the second Rocks Were There volume. And then by that time, I'll be tinkering around with material for the third Phileas Fogg book. So let's say, 23, 24, somewhere around in there. Who knows? We'll see. So everybody, have you seen any of Emma Thorne's stuff? The name doesn't ring a bell, Brian, so I'm not sure what that is referring to. I will write that down and do a search out to see what that might be in relation to. And what's the sort of topic on that? What are they typically discussing? Writing down things. I try to do the best I can from kind of like the periphery in here. I'm not on the internet relentlessly because I'm here with friends and family in the holiday and that. So we keep things at a low key on the internet front, but we will ponder around on that. So here we are, just about up to the end of the hour. In absentia, I will say Jackson Wheat, good fellow there in Louisiana, and everybody have a nice, safe New Year. Get us into 2022, and look forward to February 22nd. 2:22 p.m. of February 22nd, 2022, when everybody can binge their 2222222 analogies, and we can go on that. She covered Hovind and Powell. Oh, yes. Okay. All righty. Well, anyway, till next week, we'll find out what our connections are back in Spokane. We'll see. And Happy New Year!